you for coming here tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our November Psychological Humanities and Ethics lecture, Ars Vitae, a dialogue on psychological humanities with Professor Lasch-Quinn and three esteemed respondents who will be introduced shortly. My name is David Goodman, and I'm delighted to be the host for tonight's event. So here on BC's campus, I'd estimate we've got a good 120 people in here right now, and we've got another 150 or so joining us online via Zoom. So whether you're here in person or virtual, this time together promises to be, I think, a very interesting play between past ideas and present-day manifestations, and wisdom traditions and contemporary configurations of the self. Before formally introducing our speakers and the structure of our time, I want to throw a little something out there that's special and important to me. On August 22nd of this last summer, less than 3 months ago, we lost a moral imaginary in the field of psychology, Philip Cushman. He tragically died in a hit-and-run car accident just a few hundred yards from his home on his evening walk. Many of us are still heartbroken and sort of stinging from this. I've been working back through his book, Constructing the Self-Constructing America, a cultural history of psychotherapy with a few doctoral students here at BC, some of whom are in the room, and also with the research lab that we have going here. And the conversations have just been so rich and powerful. And a couple weeks ago, as I was working through it, I happened upon a paragraph that I think speaks to what we're up to here tonight. So I'm going to share with you some of Phil's words as we go into this, just to frame it. His words. I do not think psychotherapy has perfected its science. Psychotherapy somehow is so accurately attuned to the 20th century cultural frame of reference that it has developed an intellectual discourse and provides human services that are crucial, perhaps indispensable, to our current way of life. Psychotherapy has become emblematic of the post-World War II era. It is the historian's job, to interpret psychotherapy in such a way as to illuminate this new configuration, to speculate about the functions and influences of psychotherapy so that we can better understand the world in which we live. If the role of psychotherapist has been creator and caretaker of the realm of the interior, then we can ask a host of questions regarding the nature and function of personal interiority. How is it constructed, and what cultural, political, and economic roles it plays in our society? End quote. So this is why we've invited a historian here tonight, Professor Lasch-Quinn. Thank you. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to speak a little bit to who is bringing you this event tonight, partly because it's actually a unique thing. It's a first of kind. So the first is the Lynch School of Education and Human Development here at Boston College is the home to the newly formed Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics. Under Dean Wortham's leadership, we've received tremendous encouragement and support to get this up and running. And this is the first event that's happening as a new center. Second, the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, which is also known as Division 24 of the American Psychological Association, is a major sponsor of tonight's event. This has been a primary community for me over the years, and their generosity of spirit and generosity materially is part of what's actually allowed this event to take place. I'm always hoping that this sort of hidden gem of a group gets a little bit more play and that you, students, and other scholars can actually find their way into this community. So that's one of the hopes for something like tonight. Lastly, a team of us were awarded a John Templeton Foundation grant this year. And the purpose of it is to bring together psychology, philosophy, and theology faculty from 6 Jesuit Catholic universities from across the country, including Georgetown, Boston College, College of the Holy Cross, Fordham, Loyola Marymount University, and Seattle University. Tonight is something of a launch for this project, actually. And their faculty from across the country are sitting here in this room. Those 18 faculty from these universities are right here with us tonight. So it's a launch moment for us, and we're going to be spending the next couple days together, hopefully in some good shared learning. So up front, who you see with me are a historian, a theoretical psychologist, a psychoanalyst, a philosopher, a theologian, and clinicians. Yes, indeed. I mentioned more professions than there are individuals, and that's partly because these are Renaissance human beings who, each of which hold multiple titles, this beautiful interdisciplinary thing embodied. So let me start with my introduction with Professor Elisabeth Lasch-Quinn, Professor of History at Syracuse University and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. She's the author of 3 books, Black Neighbors, Race and the Limits of Reform in the American Settlement House Movement, Race Experts, How Sensitivity Training, Interracial Etiquette, and New Age Therapy Hijacked the Civil Rights Revolution, and most recently, Ars Vitae, The Fate of Inwardness and the Return of Ancient Arts of Living. Editor of 3 books and author of numerous articles in both scholarly and public venues, such as the New Republic and the Hedgehog Review, Dr. Lasch-Quinn has received numerous grants and awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship at the University of Rome, Italy. Very happy to have you here. Next, Frank Richardson, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Texas, Austin, past president of Division 24 of the APA, published extensively on the topics of cultural and moral value underpinnings of modern psychology and psychotherapy, determinism in social science, and hermeneutic approaches to social theory and inquiry. Donna Orange, sitting to his right, is a psychoanalyst and philosopher living in California. She teaches at NYU's postdoctoral program and the Institute for the Psychoanalytic Study of Subjectivity. Her books include, and I use them in all my courses, Thinking for Clinicians, The Suffering Stranger, Nourishing the Inner Life of Clinicians and Humanitarians, Climate Crisis, Psychoanalysis and Radical Ethics, and most recently, Psychoanalysis, History and Radical Ethics. And lastly, end of the table over here, Jeanette Rodriguez, professor at Seattle University, where she teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Couples and Family Therapy program. She serves as the director for the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture and holds the Malcolm and Marie Stamper Endowed Chair in Catholic Intellectual and Cultural Traditions. Dr. Rodriguez is a licensed marriage and family therapist and the author of several books and articles concentrated in the areas of U.S. Hispanic theology, theologies of liberation, peacekeeping, and women's spirituality. So here's what happens next. Professor Lasch-Quinn will give a formal lecture and will be followed by responses from each of these 3 wonderful discussants. Time allowing, let's hope for it, we'll have some good dialogue with the audience as well. Haley, in the back of the room here, is hosting our Zoom webinar, and she'll provide those of you online with updates and various things you need to know throughout. And when we get to the Q&A time, please use the Q&A function, and Haley will give a shout out with some of the questions so that you'll be involved in the Q&A as well. All right, I think that's more than enough. So with no further ado, please come on up, and thank you for joining us.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm deeply grateful for this honor. First time I've ever been to Boston College, and first time I've met most of you. I do know some of you in the room. I'm delighted to see you again. Thank you to Boston College, to the Templeton Foundation, to the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics, which is a very exciting venture, and thank you to all those who thought up the Cura Psychologia project. It's a fascinating project, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. And thank you to my family, all of you. In times of despair and loss, torment and injury, anger and absence, everything seems meaningless, and the universe feels empty. But there are other times. In times of happiness and presence, as in you all being here, being present, our lives overflow with meaning. Good times contain their own purpose to discover, invent, and maintain the wonder and joy of existence. Bad times fold in on themselves, collapsing possibilities. They are a blow to the core of our being, sometimes fatal for some of us. They feel impossible to escape, like a maze of endless nothingness. Finding our way through the thickets in times of difficulty and emerging able to celebrate the good. This is not a task to take lightly. Each society has its own way of navigating this task, what the ancient Roman statesman Cicero called Ars Vitae, the art of living. In fact, different cultures are in part defined, if not by set answers to the task of living, then by the resources that they provide when people ask the deepest questions about their existence. Even for those whose basic survival needs might be met, indices of well-being today suggest that modern American culture fails to provide the resources necessary for a good life. We see the fraying, fragmentation, and even absence of coherent communal commitments, the absence of working bases for collective life, and the absence of resources to form a coherent self. This calls for new ways of thinking beyond the most easily accessible self-help nostrums and other superficial answers to current quandaries and the enduring questions that we have about how to live our lives. In a seeming anarchy of advice today, signs have appeared in the return of some of the ancient arts of living, the ancient Greco-Roman philosophies of living, in everything from popular culture and movies and other places to public philosophy. These are indications of a search for deeper sources of meaning. This talk will begin with a very brief overview of the current crisis, as described by critics as the triumph of a therapeutic culture. And then I'll explore the potential of some of those new, old schools of thought, like Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Platonism, going back to Plato. I'll see, do these measure up as deep ways that we might rethink the art of living? But first, before we begin that, let's turn to a very vivid image from a piece of writing by Plato that allows us to imagine visually the struggles of being human, suggesting why there would even be a need to reflect upon how to live in the first place. In his dialogue, the Phaedrus, Plato uses an allegory to visualize this struggle of being human that we all have. Quote, "We will liken the soul, to the composite nature of a pair of winged horses and a charioteer. In heaven, Zeus drives a winged chariot whose well-matched horses obey the rein. But for humans, because their horses are unmatched, the utmost toil and struggle await the soul. One horse is a friend of honor, joined with temperance and modesty, and a follower of true glory. But the other horse is disobedient and prideful, and causes longing and the divine madness of love. The charioteer, that's each of us, must find a way to balance the rational and moral part of nature with the irrational urges and desires. The charioteer, again, that's us, needs to draw inspiration, Plato said, from divine reason to get control of these horses and guide our chariot, our soul, toward enlightenment. Plato conjures up a terrifying scene after that of the violence and chaos of the human experience when we do not make that happen. Out of the complications of life, there emerges a common set of categories of options to most real choices that we face, most decisions that have a strong pull on our thoughts and our emotions. The choices often come down to these: act or refrain from acting, in some given scenario. Forbid or permit. Resist or give in. This begins from our existence as animals, embodied beings with urges and instincts, hormones and drives. We are nothing if not creatures of desire. At the same time, the pursuit of desire or impulse imperils our existence in a world of others. Religions center on this classic set of basic choices: which desires to indulge, which to resist, and why. Without religious community, religious thinking is harder to live by. And without some sense of a higher end, transcendent purpose, or a telos, as Aristotle called it, the goal of a human life, without those things as a foundation for moral thinking, it is unclear why anyone should ever be inhibited from doing anything. The emotional moral economy of a society is what guides behavior and makes community and society possible. It also reminds us of our capacity for a self-transcendent vision, transcending our own self, a notion of goodness beyond fulfilling one's own needs and desires. A moral culture does not run on its own, but requires constant cultivation. The inner life is where it is cultivated and sustained, the place where the individual encounters the requirements and the gifts of social existence, as well as the call of freedom and the will that individuals feel, and negotiates between them. So that's what I call inwardness, really a deep kind of inwardness that we can cultivate. Today's culture gives mixed and confusing messages about how to live. Just one example would be the way people are bombarded with messages about physical fitness, joining gyms, buying gym clothes, and everything you can imagine, usually tied to spending money. And then at the same time, those same people, very same people, are bombarded with advertisements and institutions encouraging the most unhealthful kinds of eating and almost making it impossible sometimes to find good, enriching food that actually really sustains people. So that's a schizophrenia of our culture, and there's many, many other examples. What we have now is a fragile culture centered on the self's needs and wants, what sociologist Philip Rieff aptly called therapeutic. In his 1966 classic, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, Uses of Faith After Freud, he observed modern changes to the deep structures of custom and belief, resulting in a whole new outlook from a culture based on faith to a culture based on individual therapy, as in sort of letting it all out, getting whatever you want, pursuing your needs and desires at any cost. In this book, and in his earlier biography of Freud, Philip Rieff traced the rise of psychological man and the replacement of shared commitments of traditional religious communities with the quest for individual fulfillment, personal freedom, and impulse release. In Philip Rieff's view, at the heart of any culture, the very definition of culture itself is a particular set of interdictions, things you cannot do, and permissions, things you can do. How and why should we rein in our strongest and most urgent instincts, impulses, and desires? This is where culture steps in, he said. It gives meaning and essential supports. It tells us what to do with extra energies, extra time, how to steer our energies in a constructive direction. In his view, culture gives people a means of, quote, controlling the infinite variety of panic and emptiness to which they are disposed, unquote. In the form of things like books, music, love, all other aspects of culture, culture gives back bettered, he said, what it has taken away by restraining impulse and curbing certain emotions. What infuses the interdictions, things you cannot do, with possibilities for well-being and gives people the motivation to accept limits on their desires and behaviors is some kind of transcendent reference, something good that's beyond the self and what individuals want. A collective commitment higher than the self that is even deemed sacred. In the absence of such a framework of meaning, individuals have the appearance of being free, but in fact are awash in anxiety, disconnection, and he called it dis-ease disease, but also anxiety. In After Virtue, 1981, philosopher Alistair MacIntyre agrees that to pursue questions that humans have about their purposes and their existence requires some kind of moral coherence, something that's coherent, a moral framework. It has to have the idea of a telos, a goal, for what the human life is all about. We have to have some sense of what we're doing here, and it has to involve goodness. In MacIntyre's view, instead what we have now is something called emotivism, which is like our new default setting, which comes down to appealing to expressions of personal preference as the only basis of evaluative judgment. So it's just because I want something, I feel something to be that way, then somehow it is. The emphasis on what seems therapeutic for the individual validates and rewards now excessive self-concern, I would say self-obsession. It combines both meanings of self-concern, as in self-regard, just constantly thinking about the self, but also self-interest, self-concern, as in what's good only for the individual. And it encourages extreme forms of emotional unleashing. Critics of the therapeutic society, the society of anything goes as long as you want it, have often defined it as a preoccupation with the self, a lens to see personal experience through the notion of dysfunction and victimization, but also as an excess of emotion. So many critics of the therapeutic society, the culture we have now, say it's because we're privileging people's emotions too much. But I don't think that's the case. I think there is a role for emotion, but we have a distorted role right now for it. The problem is really neither too much emotion or too much reason, but it's using either of those things, using your emotions, using your thoughts, your reason, your logic, to get what you want. The problem to me is that this is instrumentalism. This is using other human beings to our own purposes. It makes them like an object. It makes them like a tool. It makes them an instrument. This involves instrumental social relations then. So that's what social relations are, is what you can do for me, what I can do for you. And your life becomes about what you can get. The loss of transcendent commitments beyond the individual's wants and needs renders people without the discipline they need to say no to something, say yes to others, on what grounds, to figure out what are the good things to do. Pursuing nothing but your own desires ironically leaves people less fulfilled, not more. So it's this mad chase for self-fulfillment, but it leaves people more disturbed, more anxious, having more dis-ease. Recent social critics have lamented the decline of a coherent moral framework as collective commitments of families, communities, and nations have given way to atomistic individualism and polarization. This discussion grows more important daily. The U.S. has become increasingly polarized as both politics and markets encourage selfishness and aggressive self-assertion. We drift somewhere between polarization, which presumes there's some basis of coherence within the different enclaves, but we drift between that and total social dissolution with just chaos of each person out for him or herself. In this crisis of meaning, extremes win out, demagogues arise, and impatience and frustration devolve into the politics of resentment. This is fertile territory for what was once called Manichaeanism, dividing the whole world and indeed the whole universe into abstract forces of good and evil. And if you're not on my side, you must be on the opposite side. This is the us-them mentality that depicts every disagreement or conflict as part of a cosmic drama between good and evil. In place of heroism, which we need desperately, we have demonization of everyone perceived to be on the other side. Against this therapeutic notion of the self appears an alternative today in the resurgence of ancient philosophies from, Greco-Roman antiquity, a long, long time ago, such as Stoicism and Epicureanism. These are just two of a whole group of schools of thought that are making an appearance again in this modern context. It seems as though the revival of ancient philosophy might automatically be a good thing. After all, didn't Socrates say that the unexamined life is not worth living? Yes, he did say that, but if we are to follow his logic, that means that even subjecting the ways we examine life is necessary. So we have to subject even the ways we are doing that examination to examination. It's not all forms are equal. We need to pay attention to the form that these ancient philosophies are taking as they re-enter our culture today in the midst of the culture of consumerism and the therapeutic. So I'll just touch on Stoicism and then Epicureanism, and then end by giving some thoughts about Platonism and its relevance today. A kind of Greek chorus has arisen in numerous genres and forms, sounding a common call for a more stoic approach to life. In everyday language, we use the word stoic to describe strength in the face of adversity and the overcoming of emotion. While the therapeutic culture, as well as the triumph of a consumerist ethos and an entertainment culture, would seem to be its very opposites, in the last couple of decades, the shelves of self-help sections of bookstores and libraries, to say nothing of Amazon listings and many other places, display works such as Don't Worry, Be Stoic, Ancient Wisdom for Troubled Times by Peter Veronese, or The Stoic Art of Living, Inner Resilience and Outer Results by Tom Morris, or Stoic Serenity, a practical course on finding inner peace by Keith Seddon. There's a celebrated Stoic movie, well, Stoics are claiming it as a Stoic movie, Gladiator, which many of you might have heard of. It grossed around $200 million and won 5 Academy Awards, including for Best Picture and Best Actor, Russell Crowe. We have many other examples of Stoicism making a resurgence. British journalist Jules Evans and other scholars, such as psychotherapist Donald Robertson, have also traced the link between Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy, perhaps the dominant form of therapy, talk therapy, in use today, pioneered by Albert Ellis. For his book, Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations, published in 2012, Evans said he interviewed people who were significantly influenced by Stoicism. And one of them was Major Thomas Jarrett, who teaches Stoic warrior resilience. This is a thing now in the military, part of training in some places in the military. The virtual world of Stoics today includes an email list, a Facebook group, and websites such as Modern Stoicism, The Stoic Place, The Stoic Life, and The Stoic Library. This is just a fraction of what's out there. The Stoic Registry, which claims that it's the online Stoic community, offers a free newsletter as well as a college of Stoic philosophers with online courses and certificates upon graduation. The only problem is that many forms of the new Stoicism do not offer an alternative to the therapeutic culture that I was talking about in the beginning of the talk. This new Stoicism can still be hijacked by the self-culture as being something that is helping you direct all the attention back to yourself. It's strange that ancient Stoicism can be used that way, but it is in many places. It can make people sometimes even colder to other people and legitimize their aggressive self-assertive behavior. If misunderstood in the way many modern versions are, the stereotype of Stoicism as being emotionless can be very harmful if you think about it as a way to think only about the self and not draw in your feelings for other people and think about them. So that's a form of ancient philosophy coming back in the therapeutic culture, but not really overthrowing it or offering a serious alternative to it, but in fact shoring up the self-obsessed culture. From another vantage point, that instead emphasizes emotion, unlike Stoicism, which tends to emphasize reason instead of emotion. Another alternative is Epicureanism, and this has come back in our own time. Some people have said that Epicureanism is the answer for them for how to live. Going back to that image from Plato, how do we handle our one horse and then the other horse, our urges, then our thoughts, and some people are gravitating to Epicureanism. So Epicurus was the ancient Greek philosopher who said that everything was about pleasure, that's the purpose of life. Pleasure is the most important human priority. It's often confused with outright hedonism, which is just abandoning yourself to huge amounts and quantities, pleasure all the time. But Epicurus was about a moderate form of pleasure, eating in the garden with friends, that kind of thing. You didn't want to indulge too much in Epicureanism because that might cause pain the next day when you're trying to recover. So it was about pleasure, but not to excess. In recent cultural history, though, the pleasure principle, as Freud called it, helps drive everything from the gourmet revolution that began in the late 20th century and the expansion of the entertainment industry to almost contain all of life, and celebrity culture, and also just consumerism more broadly. So pleasure, the cult of pleasure, is definitely here. Some of the more explicit references to a new Epicureanism include the rise of a foodie culture, film and television genres, like the vineyard or the wine movie, or the chef or cooking show. For instance, Julie and Julia, about Julia Child. the Great British Baking Show, and the list goes on and on. You all can name numerous ones. There's a large group of movies that involve food, well-being, and settings long deemed Epicurean paradises like Italy, France, India, like Eat, Pray, Love, Under the Tuscan Sun, The Lunchbox, and it goes on and on. Magazines and e-zines and websites like Epicurious, which is English, Epicuro, which is Italian, Epicure, French, Epicure, German, Epicurean travel, as well as innumerable blogs, present modern visions of Epicurean life, as though that's really what life is all about. In its modern form, however, like Stoicism, it is also a larger cultural mood underlying the consumer culture. It brings attention back to the self again. Sometimes it does offer an alternative, but it often blends all too smoothly into excessive self-focus and mainstream marketing messages, as we now see in something called the experience economy. So we're supposed to be overjoyed that people are less materialistic in terms of purchasing objects, but instead are purchasing experiences. But this, clearly, the therapeutic culture can hijack the new Epicureanism into even more reasons to focus on the self, to the legitimizing the pursuit of desire, to live supposedly a harmless life, because all you're doing is pursuing your own desires in a nonviolent way, presumably. But it's still very aggressively self-focused. So clearly, just focusing on the self in any way is not enough. That's not a kind of inwardness that would help us get to a better place individually or collectively. And the therapeutic culture can absorb any alternatives without intention to retrieve the earlier form of inwardness that made sense out of these ancient philosophies. Thinking about what form of inwardness we have today, we immediately see that we hardly lack for people taking a look at themselves. After all, ours is the era not just of the self, but the selfie. But what we now see is a gross caricature of the examined life. It has the process, the technique, and the means, so it has the activity of examining, shorn of the whole point of doing so. The examined life, which entailed a notion of a higher end for our lives, a higher purpose, has capitulated to the over-examined life. There really is such a thing, I think. With the ubiquity of confession, sort of tell all about one, the TMI culture, too much information, that's ubiquitous now everywhere. With the ubiquity of that confession as the dominant mode of conversation and of self-styling, the examined life has actually given way to hyper self-consciousness. A main form of self-examination in religious practice, confession once meant scrutiny of one's own actions, one's thoughts, for how well they accorded to moral imperatives, to divine commandments, and to transcendent visions. Confession of sin required an inner reckoning with one's God or gods. Now, all of the meticulous detail of examining the self remains. The technique of examining is intact, but the presumed audience is no longer within ourselves, within the individual, but outside. And the moral dimension has all but vanished. In this context, it is crucial to hold up our own practices to examination for what view of life they hearken to, and to find a different vantage point for examining the self. So, My last school of thought is Platonism. A very, very different alternative could be retrieved in a new Platonism. Another vivid scene allows us immediately to grasp the essence of Platonism, this school of thought, and its drastic difference from current forms of thinking about the self that I've outlined. In Plato's famous dialogue, the Symposium, Socrates' speech on the meaning of love relates a vision that he learned from a female philosopher, Diotima, who shared with him her intricate vision of love and life, what she called a ladder of love. It begins when a person falls in love with a particular person, the body and its beauty. This makes one see the beauty in another body, then in all bodies, as one becomes a lover of all beautiful bodies. From this revelation, one grasps the value of the beauty of souls as even higher than the beauty of bodies. As we ascend this ladder, the ladder of love, Socrates is calling it in Plato's dialogue, quote, the beauty of our observances, so our customs and traditions, our laws, all connected in kinship and fellowship, and even branches of knowledge. All of this dawns on us. Finally comes the view from the top. It's like a mountaintop. Here, quote, one can find a certain single knowledge connected with a beauty that has yet to be told. This opens up into a unique, eternal, and wondrous vision, an oceanic feeling, combining body, mind, soul, in a grasp of the true essences of things, beyond mere illusions that are all around us. And it inspires a love for ideas, for concepts, and for philosophy itself, which meant to Plato the love of wisdom. Love becomes one with beauty as external measures of beauty fall away, and all that is left is the inner beauty of the soul. It is the mortal human's little taste of the divine, of the eternal, of what Plato called the intelligible world, the way we are able to participate in this realm. Although we fall back down that ladder, we are capable of climbing it again, and all who witness this vision carry it with them always. We cannot afford to let vital reflection on the human condition be hijacked by the therapeutic consumer culture. It belittles and trivializes our main project in this world, living our own lives. It promotes outwardness or externalism, which is a tendency to care only about the surface of the self, and outwardness, looking at the self from the outside, not its interior depth, quality, and seriousness, or gravitas. We need to tap our cultural resources to outline an alternative kind of outward-facing inwardness. You're looking inward to cultivate yourself so that you can look outward better and bettered, to have deeper bonds with other people. Instead, replacing the inward-facing outwardness, where it's all about surface and you're completely looking at the self and you never get beyond that to look again at other people and make tighter bonds with them. Augustine's Confessions allows us to visualize the various ways of thinking, allows us to visualize this alternative kind of inwardness. If we emphasize the genre of the Confessions As autobiography, we highlight Augustine's struggle with his own early life of confusion and difficulty through the various ways of thinking that led him further astray, including Manichaeanism was one of the things that he blamed himself for gravitating toward when he was young and seeing everything as good or evil, everyone as divided into these two groups. And he described getting beyond some of his earlier ways of thinking and eventually going up the ladder of divine ascent, he called it, to God. This is no doubt one of the most enchanting personal accounts ever. The Confessions fits the genre of confession in both senses, of admission to what we do wrong, confessing in that sense, and as glorification, as an extended prayer. It stands out starkly from many modern self-oriented autobiographies and memoirs, and their very different kind of confessional style, the style of the therapeutic culture. And these modern ones lack the points that Augustine makes in spiritual confession. As apparent throughout the Confessions, Augustine was greatly influenced by Plato and also by Plotinus, who was the first major Neoplatonist who loved Plato. As religious scholars are right to point out, the Platonist works that Augustine read were not his endpoint, but an influence on him on his path to Scripture. I would emphasize, though, that Platonism was not merely an intellectual, but also a spiritual influence on this major Christian thinker. Augustine attests that his reading in Platonism did no less than reveal to him about the very existence of transcendence, that there was even such a thing as anything that was transcendent. Quote, "But having then read those books of the Platonists, and thence been taught to search for incorporeal truth, I saw thy invisible things understood by those things which are made." So seeing the transcendent through the everyday. For modern readers, the Confession stands out as a refreshing respite from the 20th century confessional mode for the way in which each personal story is analyzed for what principle, what philosophical or religious principle it yields. It is a seamless blend of a spiritual autobiography and philosophy, an expression of philosophy as ars vitae, the art of living. So my point is that we need to bring Platonism back into the picture as an approach to the art of living, and that includes the Platonism in Christianity, since there are very many different interpretations of and approaches to Christian doctrine. Some are decidedly therapeutic. Without a doubt, they fit the therapeutic culture. Others are Manichaean, Gnostic, some are Stoic, Epicurean, and even cynical. That's another ancient, not real school of thought, but approach. This is the conversation which we should be having, I think. One of the best parts of reading Augustine is that he invites us to interpret, assess, and evaluate the truth and worth of ideas along with him. He sees ideas as the living things that they are. If we do not, we risk losing our groundwork for the notion of what is true and beautiful altogether. In E.B. Pusey's preface to the Confessions, he attributes some of the most abiding interest in the Confessions to Augustine's continual movement from a vivid scene in his life to the philosophical insights that he gleaned. Quote, "Without extreme naturalness, as one to whom absence of self had become nature, he, Augustine, presses at once from the immediate subject or the fact to principles with which it is connected. And I'm saying that our ways of living, our answers to those questions of what do we resist, what do we give into, those are philosophical questions. When it comes to praise of God and the role of incarnation, it is not just a question to Augustine of whether God consoles, but how he consoles. Augustine's investigations were abstract, but he suggested how they applied to everyday life, which Pusey wrote, quote, this is very beautiful thought here, quote, may teach us how things abstract ideas, philosophical questions and answers, may be studied devotionally. Augustine shows that religion is philosophy, or can be. So in conclusion, there's a book called Therapeutic, which is on an ancient form of therapy, which is basically philosophy. In this book called Therapeutic, about the ancient approach toward therapy as a philosophical art of living involving the soul, Robert Cushman offers an elaborate and elegant analysis of Plato's approach. The cultivation of an inner life in recognition of the full range of human experience. While it would take Augustine later to flesh out its implications in the doctrine of divine grace, Cushman observes, Plato's notion of inwardness readied the human person for an unparalleled vision of the good as something beautiful and sublime. So beauty is redefined in the Platonist tradition as goodness. That's what's beautiful. Experienced as a unity, that unity of that vision at the top of the ladder of love where everything comes together, experienced as a unity, wisdom is goodness. The cultivation of the inner life changes a person once you start taking that as a serious part of your life. Changes a person irrevocably in a conversion that is profoundly cathartic and profoundly therapeutic in the richest and most meaningful sense, offering the ultimate release of love. Thank you.
Good evening. There are many people that I should thank, but I'm not going to take the time for that because each of us discussants has only a few minutes to speak with you. It is an honor and a pleasure to participate in this opening event of the Templeton Cura Psychologia project by responding to Professor Lasch-Quinn on Ars Vitae. She has aptly enacted our purpose of resituating psychology within the humanities, not only by showing us what is wrong with pervasive pop psychology, but also by offering us the example of lived philosophy in ancient Greece and Rome. These early discourses, familiar to me from the work of my beloved Pierre Hadot, offer a radical alternative to our current academic and isolated, siloed, some would say, psychologies by showing the possibility of understanding human suffering and well-being by seeing them framed within larger worldviews. If any message recurs in the three philosophies Lasch-Quinn considers, it is that we are infinitesimally small in the universe and that life is short. In the time we have, knowing we will soon be forgotten, we must live the most human possible life. But what is this good human life? It cannot be the self-absorbed and self-centered life advocated by and embodied in popular culture. Something that transcends me in scope and importance must be central. For people committed to a particular religion, including the Roman Catholicism of my childhood, spent memorizing the catechism and terrified, worried about the mortal sins I was always in danger of committing, sentencing me to Dante's Inferno forever. For us, there could be no question. The transcendent was the God of the Bible, as infallibly interpreted by the popes. The good was obedience. Other religions have their own answers, but for those of us who can no longer live within these patriarchy-structured dogmatisms, the question remains. Professor Lasch-Quinn, following Philip Rieff, characterizes the dominant answers in Western culture as therapeutic, that is, completely self-absorbed. Having spent most of my adult life as a psychologist, psychoanalyst, though always at heart a philosopher, this accusation makes me cringe, though I understand the need to shift focus. For me, the therapeutic concerns the healing of the trauma-shattered soul and its restoration to life in human community. The therapeutic welcomes the suffering other and accompanies them through what Martin Buber would have called inclusion and confirmation. That said, I understand the critique here and agree that we need more interdisciplinary resources, especially for the healers, and that ancient Ars Vitae philosophies can offer us help. Lasch-Quinn rightly notes that both Stoicism and Epicureanism have been hijacked into pop psychologies, leaving serious people to see them as superficial and trivial. So she turns to Plato and the Neoplatonists and finds integration of theology and philosophy in Augustine, as many in Christendom have done over the centuries. She made me want to reread him, but also to reread Aristotle on virtue ethics, where the good life concerns not just me, but is solidly relational. See his section on the Nicomachean Ethics on friendship, for example. But I have, over the years, found two other multidisciplinary or pre-disciplinary resources, one ancient, one almost contemporary. Whenever I am in trouble, not John Lewis's good trouble, but what I might call bad trouble, I reach for one of my translations of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or for the Discourses of Epictetus. Their clarity about what is important and what is not, about what is up to me and what is not, and about how the good human life consists of kindness and service to others, it recenters my scrambled soul. I begin to read them every day and until the crisis has passed, sometimes for several months or more. They become my daily spiritual reading. Here are some recent bits of Marcus's reminders to himself. His meditations were reminders to himself. Remember, he says, you shouldn't be surprised that a fig tree produces figs, nor the world produces what it produces. A good doctor isn't surprised when his patients have fevers, or a helmsman when the wind blows against him. Or here's another one. When you have trouble getting out of bed in the morning, remember that your defining characteristic, what defines a human being, is to work with others, not to pull the covers up. Marcus passes immediately from his considerations of the big picture to the qualities or virtues needed to cope with the here and now. First among these is attentiveness to the nature and importance of the thing or task before me. What is it, this thing that now forces itself on my notice? What is it made up of? How long was it designed to last? And what qualities do I need to bring to bear on it? Tranquility, courage, honesty, trustworthiness, straightforwardness, independence, or what? These are only samples, clearly overlapping with the Aristotelian virtues, but they show how what I learned long ago to call spiritual reading can support and nourish the inner life of which Elisabeth Lasch-Quinn speaks. The important point is that for each of us is to find something or some things and read them repeatedly. Another resource for me has become the Ethics of Emmanuel Levinas, whose orientation toward the suffering other in non-indifference has become my leading preoccupation in recent years. This corrects for the me focus of love for the inner life. I have for many years described myself as a hermit scholar, but I have to come out sometimes, by installing a sense of pre-primordial responsibility for the other, for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. This kind of ethics is not about me, or about how good or innocent I am, but about the capacity to be affected, to be taken hostage by the suffering of the other, even to the point of substitution, one for the other. This ethics does not calculate with Kant or with the utilitarians. This ethic responds. It has little interest in my purity of heart or in my virtues, unlike Kierkegaard or Aristotle. It concerns the other first and last, and the other's death matters more than mine. Sorry, Heidegger. So in these few minutes, I give you a glimpse into my own resources for addressing Lasch-Quinn's concerns. And again, let me thank everyone concerned for the privilege of responding.
Good evening. Here are just a few comments on this fine paper from a semi-nerdy philosophical psychologist whose favorite movie happens to be The Gladiator, for better or worse. It seems important to me to note that according to Professor Lasch-Quinn's, cultures are defined not so much by set answers to the task of living as by the resources they provide when people ask the deepest questions about life and living. She suggests that current American culture simply fails to provide such resources. That way of putting it seems to me essential in a post-traditional pluralistic cultural universe. The paper draws on Philip Reif's brilliant analysis of our predicament in The Triumph of the Therapeutic. Reif documents an acute shift in modern times from a culture based on faith to one based on therapy. Older cultures contain, the paper says, a reference to transcendence or divinity, or Brahman, or Tao, or Allah, that sets limits on some of our strongest impulses and desires. The philosopher Charles Taylor suggests that such a reference to transcendence in the breakthrough philosophies and religions of the so-called axial age from 800 to 200 BCE involves a particular complementary symbiosis of renunciation and flourishing. There is an aiming beyond life toward the transcendent, involving a renunciation of some conventional goods and purposes, followed by a return to flourishing, understood now in partly different terms, often with compassion toward and care for all others as its mainstay. Some limits are essential if one is to heed a lifelong call to character, entailing the cultivation of moral excellences like courage, moderation, humility, or compassion. However, a way of life shaped in the pursuit of these virtues can provide compensation in the form of a sturdier sense of meaning and purpose in life that may help, in Reef's nifty words, in controlling the infinite variety of panic and emptiness to which humans are disposed. I myself never experience any of those feelings, but I understand that many people do. That's a joke. I'm much longer on panic than emptiness. Partly strong reactions against the various injustices and moral blind spots of traditional cultures, there emerges a new culture of therapy with its novel character ideal of psychological man who looks askance at such limits as unjustified or ill-motivated, and whose main quest, according to Reef, is for individual fulfillment, personal freedom, and impulse release. I found quite interesting the paper's discussion of how a number of thinkers and writers quite understandably return to earlier wisdom traditions like Stoicism and Epicureanism for a richer form of inwardness. Their ideas hint at a better path of living, but are easily hijacked by the self-culture as all about the self. I think exploring some of those in some detail, perhaps even following the book that on Ars Vitae that's about to come out, would make a great master's thesis or an honors paper, and I suggest that to you. The paper concludes with a brief sketch of a new Platonism that might provide a drastically different outward-facing inwardness, a true inwardness, not one endlessly preoccupied with how it is being gratified or confirmed by others in the world. In this vein, Plato's vision of a ladder of love in the Symposium points to where, among other things, love becomes one with beauty, and a mortal human may glimpse transcendence and taste the divine. Why is it so difficult to loosen the grip of the culture of therapy and ever mount the first rung on Plato's ladder of love? In part, it seems because American society is pervaded by a profoundly anti-authoritarian spirit. As Erich Fromm put it in the 1940s, we have a well-developed sense of freedom from dogmatic authority and other unwarranted impediments to our freedom and control, but lack a corresponding sense of freedom to or freedom for that would give context, direction, and a deeper purpose to any increase in freedom or opportunity that happens to come our way. Fromm felt that this approach lead one to become directionless and empty, prone to shaky self-esteem and a constant need of confirmation by others. The main issue with individualism and therapy culture is that they abstract individuals out of their multifaceted embeddedness in history and culture in order to protect them from dogmatism and domination. But then they leave them high and dry with no clear or proper way of relating to others, to society, or even to themselves, except instrumentally, more or less effectively, in a control or be controlled world. Plainly, we stand in need of a richer conception of human flourishing in the real world, while often terribly meaningful, provides us with a frail, dangerous, confusing, and mortal existence. A cornerstone of such a richer view might be the distinction that virtue ethics makes between, one, instrumental activities that aim at external goods or payoffs like wealth, power, prestige, or comfort, and two, more or less excellent activities in some ethical, aesthetic, or spiritual sense that are part of a way of being we deem intrinsically worthwhile and good in themselves. The instrumental serves as an infrastructure for the cultivation of the excellent, and in this view should be limited to that role and not become an end in itself. Our need to acquire what Christopher Lasch termed a new wisdom of limits in modern times shows up nowhere so much as in the conversations, the debate, and the dialogue we have about serious moral and cultural issues. As Taylor put it, we can't even enter into that dialogue unless we have robust beliefs and convictions concerning things we truly care about and in which we have what he calls a deep identity investment. But part of that investment is bound to be in distorted images we have of others. So we need not to just compromise and get along with others, but to learn from the past, others, and other cultures in ways that often incurs a painful identity cost. We can participate honestly and responsibly in that process, requiring both courage and humility, but it is full of surprises and not under our direct control. This idea painstakingly dissolves, one might say, both individualism and instrumentalism. Well, to finish up, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then maybe a living example of something like the good or the goodness of which the paper so nicely speaks might be worth many pages of theory. The remarkable life of Albert Woodfox, who passed away this last summer, represents a moving story of a life lived within severe limits that might help break our addiction to ever-expanding possibilities and endless progress as the main or only pathway to a good life. He began in youth as a hardened criminal in the 6th Ward in New Orleans. In 1972, already in prison, Woodfox was charged based on no evidence other than his recent association with the Black Panthers with the murder of a prison guard. In 2014, the U.S. Court of Appeals overturned his conviction at age 69, citing racism. In the meantime, he endured over 40 years in solitary confinement, the longest such imprisonment in American history. In Angola, Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as one of the worst. Over the years, he attained a kind of ethical sainthood. His tiny cell, about 6x9 cell, became a university full of law books. He won small privileges for all solitary prisoners. He and a fellow prisoner helped to set up a chapter of the Black Panthers that protested the stealing of food and organized its more equitable distribution. They fought against rife sexual slavery and worked to stamp it out and console its victims. In one obituary, it is reported that for 2 hours a day, Woodfox would read all about the troubles of the outside world, which not only took him mentally out of his cell, but expanded his sympathy with the whole world of suffering. He did not care now if, when he complained about his toilet backing up, tear gas was sprayed in his face. Far worse was happening elsewhere. Woodfox and his colleagues Herman Wallace and Robert King became close, warm, lifelong friends, working and learning together, constantly passing notes to one another through adjacent cells. During their one free hour a day to leave their cells and walk for a small bit of exercise, they held classes for other inmates, passing out carbon-copied math and grammar lessons, about which they were quizzed the next day. The title of Woodfox's obituary in the magazine The Economist is What Freedom Means. It took him a while to adjust to life outside of prison. He feared crowds because he felt an attack might come from any side. Eventually, he became a fierce campaigner for an end to the evil of solitary confinement. When he did so, he discovered anew the truth that had struck him years before in his small cell when he had read the words of Frantz Fanon, quote, "I feel my soul as vast as the world, truly as deep as the deepest of rivers. My chest has the power to expand to infinity. I was made to give." I offer that as a story of the wisdom of limits. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Let me first of all begin by thanking the organizers of this incredible symposium for inviting me to offer some reflections. I'm always grateful to have an opportunity to both share and expand my thinking. I consider myself an interdisciplinary border theologian. I'm not a philosopher. So I do what's called theological ethnography. That means I go actually into the field. I live with the community, whether it's the indigenous population or the people in the jungles of Chiapas or El Salvador or South Africa. And I write about and I listen carefully to their experience. I've also spent a lot of time in Asia. So in conjunction with the wisdom that I find in the libraries and in these diverse disciplines, I go to what's called the living texts, right? That is the wisdom of the people. I actually believe in the wisdom of the people, right? Or what the church calls the sense fidelium. And I engage in this work both as what's called a Latin American liberation theologian and a behavioral science clinician. So my background is in both theology and psychology.
So I have a question for you. How many of you students out there have to write a paper about what you heard tonight? Yeah, come on, be honest. I'm trying to help you out here. I'm going to give you 5 points that you can take notes on, okay? Would that be helpful? Yeah, okay, let's do it. So point number 1. I'm going to skip my comments about the ancients just because of time and because I know you have papers to write. So number 1, Dr. Lasch-Quinn wrote in her paper, quote, "In times of despair and loss, everything seems meaningless and the universe feels empty. Bad times fold in themselves collapsing possibilities." So I want to respond to some of these points that you wrote in your paper of things that it made me think about. And so point 1 is what I call exposure to different worldviews. For me, this is a prelude for an argument for exposing oneself, exposing yourself, and embracing, trying to understand different epistemologies, because that would expand and would lead us into a deeper place of deeper possibilities. Maybe unbeknownst to us, it's like a fish in water. A fish knows nothing else than what it's in, right? And so we talk a lot about context, right? And content. But Father Kovenbach, the former provincial of the Jesuits, talked about contact, right? Do we have enough contact with people who are different from us? And can we listen patiently enough to really enter a dialogue that might mean for us to shift, right? A lot of times you get into conversations with people and they're just waiting to jump in, right? To say what they want to say. That's not a dialogue, right? A dialogue is having an open discussion, so open that you yourself might shift and might change. All right. Anyway, it's foolish and unwise, I think, to waste a good crisis. And we are in a crisis right now in our country and in our world, and not just because of this therapy of culture that has silenced us in so many ways. Point number 2, the need for what I'm going to call epistemological navigation, all right? Dr. Lasch-Quinn lifts up the allegory of Zeus with the chariots, right? The 2 horses. You've read that in your philosophy classes, I think, right? And the focus there is about balance, right? But I think it's more challenging to think in terms of and to develop a skill set of what I'm calling epistemological navigation. People of color, in particular, really know what this is about because they have to in order to survive. What would be the value or difference for you between balance and what I'm calling epistemological navigation? This is the double consciousness that Du Bois and Anzaldúa talk about. And there's a sense in which this epistemology and their ontology and their sense of how to make sense of life has to navigate the master account, right? The official view, the dominant culture. And the official view is not only dominating, it's collapsing for everybody. Double consciousness gives one a sense, really, that the problem isn't for us to come up with one epistemology, but rather to navigate. So how does a Buddhist live in a corporate world? How do the poor go on living in a world where they're invisible? How do the wretched of the earth find their place? So I think it's not by reading Plato. I mean, Plato is fine, don't get me wrong. I love Plato, right? But I think it's about openings. It's about openings, being more generous, right? Hence the importance of culture, language, in fostering identity. I have this wonderful story when I was in Chiapas, the Setales, the Mayan Indians, were translating the Christian Bible. And what they did was they would take certain phrases from the Bible and they would give it to the elders and they'd ask them to translate it, right? When I was there, the phrase that they were trying to translate was the scriptural passage that said, "And Jesus said to Peter, 'Unto thee, Peter, I give thee the keys of the kingdom.'" Right? Everybody remember that passage? Right. Well, guess what? In Chiapas, there's no keys, right? Because there's no doors. Therefore, there's no locks, right? So everybody was very curious about how they were going to translate this, right? So we all waited for the elders to come back. And they came back, and this is how they translated. They said, "And unto thee I give thee that which opens." Right? just opened it up, didn't it? Right? Because we don't know what the that is. But whatever that is that can open is a good thing. Yes? See? You can answer me when I say, see? Yes? Okay. Point number 3. Dr. Lasch-Quinn says, quote, even if not the only choices out of the complications of life, there emerges a common set of categories of options to most real choices or decisions. Okay. Well, I think about that, like when I read that, again, I'm a liberationist. I'm also a genocide scholar. I am the daughter of a Spanish Jewish father and a Catholic Indian mother from Latin America. And so I, from very early age, had to learn how to navigate these different voices. And my father's the one who taught me about choiceless choice, that there are choiceless choices. And is it really a choice? It's like the difference between the way we talk about equality and equity, right? Everybody talks about equality, right? But without taking into consideration the equitability of who you're dealing with, there's no justice or equality, right? So I teach at a Jesuit Catholic university where, I don't know about here, but the tuition is like $27,000 a year. Is that what yours is? More or less? More? Much higher. Oh my goodness, okay. Maybe it's not a good example. Okay, well, so the point is you have these young students from high school, right, fighting or competing for the same chair in the classroom, right? Except some students are coming from high schools that are substandard, right? And some students are coming from Ivy League high schools where they have every resource made available to them. But we're going to claim that we're going to be equal because everybody has a chance to come. Is that equal? Is it equitable? All right, I'll let you think about that. All right. So, in a way, I think the question always comes down to, as you were saying, Dr. Lasch-Quinn, desire, but whose desire? The desire of the person in the slave-holding mansion or the desire of the person picking the cotton, right? I mean, they both have desire, right? But really, it's hard to say if we're talking about the same thing, isn't it? Sí or no? See? Yes, okay. Dom Helder Câmara was a former Archbishop of Brazil, and he used to say, why is it when I give poor people food, they call me a saint. But when I ask, why are they poor? They call me a communist, right? We can also say that I give the depressed Prozac. When I give the depressed Prozac, they call me a doctor. But if I ask why they're depressed, they're going to call me insane, right? To have to deal with those issues. So who carries the master account? And who offers the solution? Well, how about creating a space for more than one universe, more than one world, more than one culture? Because not all cultures are tolerated by the master culture. And the failure of this master culture has everything to do with its desire to be the one account and close itself off from other psychic resources, right? Why is it so difficult to allow yourself to be in a posture of a culture rather than the culture, right? Is this making sense? Oh, thank you. Thank you for answering. I was actually expecting it from them. Okay. Point number 4. I'm almost done. So we're living in a culture, like I said, that sees itself as the culture rather than a culture. And Dr. Lasch-Quinn offers a definition of culture in her paper as being a particular set of interdictions and permissions. I always think of culture as an arch of meaning, right? How people make and understand meaning. But you know, there's a performance aspect to culture, there's a material aspect to culture, and there's a meaning-making part of culture. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes I'll work with parish leaders, and they'll say that they want a multicultural mass or a bicultural mass. And they throw a sarape on the altar. Everybody know what a sarape is? A shawl? What's he say, sarape? Like a blanket, a Latin American looking blanket, right? And they'll throw it on the altar and they'll say that's a Spanish mass, right? Have any of you experienced something like this? No? Yes? that focusing on a very small aspect of culture, which is its material aspect, right? The blanket, the color, right? But not dealing with meaning or identity, right? Or language. Super important, I think. Anyway, my point is that I always think of culture, as I said, as having to do with meaning, providing meaning. And Reeves, who you quote in your paper, I think is an important book. It's important because it contextualizes things. And I want to say that, at least in my own field of theology, all theology is contextual. Finally, number 5 has to do with the cave of Socrates, which I love. How many of you have read that? Yes? Okay, great. So I think it's a great example about the problem of ideology. It's one of Plato's, I think, best insights. So everyone in a cave, and they can only see what they've been shown, and they can see that they are being shown things, and they can't turn around. They're prisoners. And so whatever they think is within a menu that's been created for them by the people who keep them in the cave. So they don't have the power to turn around and say, whoa, who are these people behind me, right? Where is this stuff coming from? They never question their reality. They don't even question their chains. They look at the chains and they figured, well, everybody's got chains, right? Tell me if I'm wrong, my philosophy colleagues. And then mysteriously, philosophy begins when one of the prisoners is able to turn around by mistake. And he simply goes, what the hell is going on? And he starts to search, right? And I think that's good. That's a good place to be, right? To search, to desire something more. And I think that's powerful because that's immediately transferable to all of our master ideologies, right? He goes out of the cave and he's really thinking for himself, but you know what? It's blinding when he goes out in the cave, right? And that's another great image. That's another great truth, that once you come out of the limitation and darkness of your own posture, you open up. Sometimes the light hurts our eyes, right? It's hard. It's hard where to go when you start navigating epistemologies. And it's not just about ideology. I realize it's about security. It's about safety. It's what I call clinically the dealing with the costs and the payoffs. What are the costs and the payoffs for X movement? And for the people who killed him, the cost was too great. So it reads like a really good story, I think, from the elders, like a good indigenous story, because it's good at turning your mind a little bit. And this is the moment in which even the poor would say, whoa, we've been set up, and that's hard. So the cave story is a story of liberation. Martin Luther King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, said, we have to rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths. And he cites Socrates more than once in that letter. So we've always taken for granted, for example, segregation and racism. That's the cave. And then there's people like Socrates who pay the ultimate price, his life, to say, wait a minute, that does not get you off the hook, right? So I want to conclude by just saying that all of these worldviews have pluses and minuses. But if we begin to turn it into a more pluriversal consideration, there's openings to some other very radical insights that would also keep the context of these considerations in their place. So universe, one turn, the one great turn. Pluralverse, the many terms. And even in the language of conversion, of course, this conversion is really about an ontological shift, right? So I want to end with 2 quotes from 2 different great people. Number 1, St. Ignatius, who said, I did not see new things, I saw them in a new way. That's conversion. And that's an ontological shift. And finally, our Pope Francis, who said, guess what? Reality is bigger than ideas. Thank you very much.
Well, we're well over time now, so we don't have time for questions at this point, but if you would join me in thanking these amazing speakers.